Why did evolution stop working on humans 50,000 years ago? It's a strange idea, isn't it? That something so vast, so slow, and so deeply tangled in the survival of every living thing might have just stopped. Or perhaps, more accurately, that it started ignoring us. We haven't exactly noticed it happening, which is part of the problem. Tonight, we'll follow that question through time. From the earliest life forms to the odd creatures we've become. We'll explore how evolution shaped every inch of your body, how it favored certain traits over others, and why it might have quietly walked off the job sometime in the late Stone Age. Possibly with a sigh. Possibly because we made ourselves too inconvenient to deal with. To begin, imagine all of human history compressed into a single calendar year. Agriculture shows up on 31st December. The first smartphones? They blink into existence at about 11-59-59. And yet, our bodies, our teeth, our knees, our brains, they belong to creatures who spent the other 364 days chasing antelope and hoping not to get eaten. We like to think of ourselves as the finished product of evolution. As if natural selection worked tirelessly for millions of years only to produce, well, us. But evolution doesn't produce masterpieces. It produces survivors. And once survival stops depending on your genes, the process gets bored and moves on. Or rather, it just waits, very, very patiently. Over the next while, we'll explore what evolution actually is, how it works, and why it might no longer be working in quite the same way on humans. We'll see how modern medicine, cities, and indoor heating have shifted the pressures that used to keep us in line. And we'll ask whether we're still evolving at all, or whether we've just traded biology for culture. This isn't a story of failure. It's a story of change. A quiet change, largely unnoticed, where natural selection was replaced not by chaos, language, tools, social rules, antibiotics, and climate control, all quietly rewriting the terms of our survival without asking permission from our genes. Of course, evolution hasn't really stopped. That's not how it works. But something has shifted, something fundamental. It's as if the forces that once shaped every eyelash and tendon have loosened their grip. And now we're left in a strange in-between. Still animals, but no longer entirely bound by nature's rules. This leads us to consider the mystery at the heart of tonight's question. What changed around 50,000 years ago? And why might that change have marked the end of evolution's reign over us? So, has evolution actually stopped working on humans? Or have we just stopped paying attention to how it works? It's a genuine question, and like most good questions in science, the answer depends entirely on how you define the problem. In this case, what do we really mean when we say evolution? And what would it look like if it stopped? Evolution isn't magic. It doesn't make things better. It doesn't have a goal. It's simply a process where living things change over time because some versions of them survive and reproduce more than others. That's it. Genes vary, environments change, some traits help, others don't. What survives, continues. What doesn't, doesn't. Nature doesn't send out apology letters. For evolution to work, a few conditions have to be in place. First, there must be genetic variation, differences in traits that can be passed down. Second, there needs to be competition. More individuals are born than can survive. And third, some traits must increase the chance of survival and reproduction. No competition, no pressure, no selection. Just everyone plodding along, passing on whatever happens to be in their DNA suitcase. So what happens when you take that competition away? When nearly everyone survives childhood, finds a mate, and passes on their genes, regardless of their eyesight, immune system, or ability to digest dairy, it turns out you start to notice evolution slowing down, not stopping, but muttering something under its breath and taking longer tea breaks. This brings us to around 50,000 years ago. A rough estimate, of course, but something began changing then. Humans began spreading across the planet, developing culture, tools, and eventually farming. These weren't just minor lifestyle upgrades. They changed the pressures that had shaped our species for millions of years. We started altering our environment instead of being altered by it, like deciding to remodel your house halfway through an earthquake. And with this shift came a new kind of evolution. Not biological, but cultural. Language, knowledge, beliefs, and habits began passing from brain to brain, not just from gene to gene. Suddenly, information could evolve faster than DNA ever could. A clever idea could spread in a generation. A genetic trait might take 1,000 years. That changes the whole game. The result is a strange overlap. Biological evolution still ticking along, but now shadowed by a louder, faster, and far less patient sibling. A sibling that doesn't care much about natural selection and prefers uploading software updates instead of waiting for mutations. This leads us to consider how that shift began to affect the human experience and what it means for the way we see ourselves today. Look down at yourself for a moment. Your hands, your spine, your feet, all of it shaped by pressures you've never experienced. Your body isn't designed for Wi-Fi and microwave meals. It's a patchwork of survival strategies from a time when staying alive meant running barefoot, throwing rocks, and trying not to starve. Not exactly the ideal prep for queuing at the post office. Take your back, for instance. The human spine evolved from a horizontal animal walking on 4 legs. We stood upright, rather recently, in evolutionary terms, and frankly, our vertebrae haven't quite forgiven us. Then there's the appendix, a leftover from a time when our ancestors ate a lot more plants and needed the extra help digesting them. Now it mostly waits for the right moment to explode during holidays. But these quirks aren't just medical curiosities. They're reminders that natural selection shaped our bodies in an entirely different world. One with no paracetamol, no spectacles, and no convenient supermarket meal deals. If you couldn't see well enough to spot a predator, or digest enough calories to make it through winter, that was the end of your branch on the tree. Even today, your body carries signals from that world. Why does sugar feel so rewarding? Because it used to be rare and valuable. Why do we feel stress in traffic? Because our brains still treat threat like it's a charging animal, not someone in a Volvo who didn't indicate. We're walking around with Stone Age wiring and wondering why it doesn't handle group chats very well. Your mind, too, wasn't shaped for truth. It was shaped for survival. That means noticing danger more than safety, assuming patterns where none exist, and picking up social cues like your life depends on it, because it often did. So yes, you can thank evolution for your ability to panic over things that probably aren't going to kill you. This mismatch between past and present makes us feel strange in our own skin sometimes. We live longer, move less, eat more, and exist in environments our ancestors could never have imagined. And yet, our biology is still tuned for scarcity, risk, and high physical demand. As if someone gave a caveman a smartphone and said, "Good luck." This leads us to consider how our direct experiences, what we see, feel, and believe to be true, can mislead us about the reality of the world and the slow, quiet processes still shaping it. What you see around you, cars, heating, supermarkets, indoor plumbing, is not the environment evolution shaped you for. Your body still thinks it's on the savannah somewhere, hoping not to freeze, starve, or get bitten by something with large teeth. Modern life has done a rather impressive job of removing the survival pressures that natural selection relies on. For most of human history, survival was a daily negotiation. If you were too slow, too fragile, or simply unlucky, you didn't pass your genes on. But now, you can wear glasses, use an inhaler, and have a perfectly healthy child after a C-section. Things that would have been game over in the wild. Evolution didn't stop working, we just started working around it. Take medicine, for instance. Antibiotics save lives that would once have been lost to minor infections. Insulin allows people with type 1 diabetes to live full lives. These are clear wins for humanity. But, from nature's point of view, they remove the link between genetic traits and reproductive success. Natural selection can't act on traits if those traits no longer affect survival. Then there's agriculture. Once humans began growing food, we broke the natural feedback loop between environment and survival. No longer were we entirely at the mercy of what we could hunt or gather. We created food surpluses, built settlements, and altered ecosystems to suit our needs. With each improvement, the pressure for genetic adaptation lessened. Add to that the safety nets of modern society: hospitals, laws, heating, public transport, and we've effectively bubble-wrapped ourselves against nature's more brutal filters. That's not a criticism. Most people would prefer antibiotics to being selected out of the gene pool by a bacterial infection. But evolution isn't sentimental. No selection pressure means no change. Of course, some selection pressures still exist. Disease, fertility, and even social behavior can influence who passes on their genes, but the scale and type of pressure have shifted. In many parts of the world, survival depends more on economics, healthcare access, and luck than on raw genetic advantage. If natural selection is still acting on us, it's doing so quietly and very slowly. The trouble is, our senses are tuned for short-term experience. We feel warmth, hunger, and fear, not geological time or shifting gene frequencies. So it's easy to believe evolution has stopped simply because we can't feel it. But nature doesn't operate on our schedule. It never has. This leads us to consider what happens when we zoom out, beyond daily life, beyond history, to scales where these long, invisible changes come into focus. The human brain isn't built for deep time. We're good at spotting faces in clouds and remembering where we left our keys. But try to grasp the difference between 100 years and 100,000, and things begin to blur. Evolution, of course, doesn't mind. It's been working quietly for billions. Let's start with something familiar. A year has 365 days. A human life, if you're lucky and keep an eye on your cholesterol, might stretch to around 30,000 days. Evolution, by contrast, takes place across tens of millions of generations. If you imagine all of Earth's history as a single day, humans don't show up until about 11:59. And we're already asking for the manager. Most changes you notice, aging, seasons, haircuts, happen on what scientists call the human scale. That's time and space as we experience it. Seconds, minutes, meters, days. but natural processes often play out across much longer stretches. Erosion, plate tectonics, star formation, and yes, evolution, all work on scales that feel almost imaginary. Consider that life first appeared around 3.5 billion years ago. Dinosaurs ruled the planet for over 160 million years. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Your mobile phone model has probably lasted too. From evolution's perspective, your entire lifetime isn't even a blink. It's the blink's blink. The rate of evolutionary change depends on many factors: generation length, population size, environmental pressure. For bacteria, evolution can happen fast, thousands of generations in a matter of weeks. For elephants, much slower. And for humans, especially modern ones protected by culture and technology, the pace has almost ground to a crawl. This mismatch between evolutionary time and daily life means we often misunderstand change. We expect quick fixes, clear outcomes, and visible progress. Evolution, on the other hand, is a bit like watching paint dry on a glacier during winter. It's always happening, but never in a way that feels satisfying on a Thursday afternoon. And yet, over deep time, evolution shapes everything. The position of your eyes, the curve of your spine, your sense of hunger, all sculpted by this slow, silent process responding to ancient conditions. Conditions that, in many cases, no longer exist. Which raises the question, if the pressure's gone, is the change still happening? This leads us to consider how evolution actually works. Not in vague poetic terms, but as a specific mechanism. A process that, despite its glacial pace, has remade the living world countless times. So, how does evolution actually work? Not in vague motivational terms. Everything happens for a reason, but as a clear, measurable process. At its core, evolution by natural selection is a filter. A slow, unsentimental, and entirely impersonal filter that decides which versions of living things carry on, and which ones don't. It starts with variation. No two individuals are exactly the same. Even identical twins develop small differences. These variations come from changes in DNA, the molecule that carries instructions for building and maintaining life. Most changes are random. Some help, some don't. Most do absolutely nothing. Nature, it turns out, is constantly rolling the dice. Next comes selection. In any environment, certain traits improve your chances of surviving and reproducing. These might include better eyesight, thicker fur, stronger bones, or in some species, the ability to shout convincingly at rivals. Traits that help tend to be passed on more often. Over many generations, those traits become more common in the population. This doesn't happen because life is trying to improve. There's no direction, no master plan. Evolution is not a designer. It's more like a quality control system that only notices when things fail. If your genes help you live long enough to have children, they get another round. If not, well, nature doesn't send condolences. The engine behind all of this is mutation. Mutations are changes in the DNA sequence, sometimes caused by errors when cells copy themselves, sometimes triggered by environmental factors like radiation. Most mutations are harmless or irrelevant. A few are harmful, and a very small number might be helpful if the environment rewards them. It's also important to remember that natural selection doesn't work on individuals, it works across populations over time. You don't evolve a new trait because you personally need one. Populations shift slowly, generation by generation, as helpful traits increase and unhelpful ones fade away. Think of it as the world's least efficient editing process. This process works best under certain conditions: limited resources, competition, and environmental pressure. When life is difficult, evolution moves faster. When life is comfortable, it slows. And when the environment stops rewarding some traits over others, evolution starts to drift. It doesn't stop, it just gets less focused. This leads us to consider what lies beneath the surface of this mechanism. Not just the survival of the fittest, but the deeper forces that shape entire populations over long periods of time. Natural selection is just the beginning. While it's often the headline act, there are other forces at play in evolution, quieter, stranger ones that work beneath the surface. These forces don't always get the attention they deserve, but they're crucial to understanding how species change, and sometimes why they stop changing altogether. One of these forces is genetic drift. It's what happens when chance, not fitness, determines which genes get passed on. In small populations especially, random events can have a big impact. A helpful mutation might disappear purely by bad luck, while a completely useless trait might spread just because the right individuals had enough children. Basically, evolution sometimes flips a coin. Then there's gene flow, the movement of genes between populations. When individuals from one group migrate and reproduce in another, they bring new variations with them. This increases genetic diversity and can slow down or speed up change, depending on the context. Humans, with our habit of moving around, have become very good at gene flow. Some of us are practically walking biology exchanges. Population bottlenecks are another factor. These occur when a population shrinks suddenly, due to disease, famine, or disaster, leaving only a small number of survivors. Their genes, purely by chance, define the next generation. It's not the fittest who remain, just the luckiest. If evolution had a slogan, it might be good enough most of the time. These forces don't always pull in the same direction. Natural selection rewards certain traits, while drift and chance can scatter them unpredictably. In some cases, these random forces overpower selection entirely. This is particularly true in modern humans, where our large, global population and complex societies dilute selective pressures considerably. Over deep time, these processes have shaped everything from the color of beetles to the beaks of finches. But they don't work in a vacuum. The environment still matters. It acts like a filter through which all these forces operate. When the environment is stable, evolution slows. When it shifts suddenly, traits are tested, and only some make it through. Here's where things get interesting. Humans haven't just adapted to environments. We've started remaking them. We heat our homes, store our food, treat our illnesses. We protect ourselves from the very pressures that used to drive selection. In doing so, we've changed not just how we live, but how evolution acts on us. This leads us to consider how these same processes apply across the natural world, and why they reveal something important about the way life changes, regardless of species or scale. Up to now, we've focused mainly on humans, our bodies, our quirks, our rather creative approach to avoiding natural selection. But evolution isn't uniquely ours. The process that shaped your spine also shaped sea sponges, sunflowers, and the bacteria on your toothbrush. The rules are the same. It's just the results that differ wildly. In bacteria, evolution can be astonishingly fast. A single strain of E. coli can evolve antibiotic resistance in just a few generations, hours, not millennia. That's because bacteria reproduce quickly, mutate often, and face constant selection pressure. There's no debate about whether evolution works in microbes. It's practically doing backflips. Meanwhile, across longer timescales, evolution reshapes entire species of birds, insects, mammals, and plants. The peacock's tail, the giraffe's neck, the cheetah's speed, all examples of traits refined through countless generations under pressure from predators, mates, or changing environments. Nature's very patient, but also quite ruthless. Yet, evolution isn't clever. It's not building towards perfection. It only works with what already exists. That's why animal designs often look less like elegant engineering and more like a series of rushed fixes. The nerve that loops around the giraffe's heart before reaching its larynx is a particularly daft example. Millions of years of refinement, and it still takes a detour. What unites all of this, from bacteria to blue whales, is the indifference of the process. Evolution doesn't reward good behavior, it doesn't punish laziness. It only deals in survival and reproduction. Traits that help those two things tend to stick around. Traits that don't. No points for effort. Even in cases where selection seems to vanish, such as animals in captivity or humans in cities, the underlying mechanism still exists. It's just waiting. Pressures change, and when they do, evolution kicks back in. That's part of what makes it universal. It's not always active in the same way, but it never disappears entirely. From this wide-angle view, humans are not an exception to the rules. We're just a curious example of what happens when one species learns how to manipulate its environment so effectively that it temporarily blunts natural selection. Not ends it, just changes the terms. This leads us to consider how time itself affects these processes, and how stepping back even further reveals just how quietly and consistently evolution has operated across deep history. To understand evolution properly, you need to step outside the human sense of time. Not just a little, quite a lot. We measure life in years and decades. Evolution measures in thousands, millions, sometimes hundreds of millions. From its perspective, the entirety of recorded human history is the equivalent of being late for something and glancing at the clock for half a second. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been around for roughly 300,000 years. That sounds like a long time until you realize Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old. For most of our history, we lived in small groups, hunted animals, gathered plants, and tried not to freeze. Civilization, cities, agriculture, writing, only showed up in the last 5,000 years. That's 1.6% of our time as a species. The idea that something significant changed around 50,000 years ago begins to make sense when you look at this broader timeline. Around then, humans began creating complex tools, forming symbolic language, producing cave art, and spreading rapidly across continents. It marked the beginning of behavioral modernity, when our ancestors started doing things recognizably human, rather than just upright ape. These changes weren't purely genetic. They weren't caused by a sudden wave of mutations that made us smarter overnight. They were cultural, passed not through DNA, but through imitation, teaching, and shared memory. And once culture took hold, it moved much faster than biology could ever keep up with. Evolution was still happening. It just wasn't leading the conversation anymore. This shift matters It means our survival began to depend less on inherited physical traits and more on learned behavior. A child with slightly worse vision could still thrive if someone invented spectacles. A slower runner might do just fine if the group developed better weapons. Natural selection was still in the room. It just had less to do. This is what makes humans unusual. We're not the only species with culture. Whales, dolphins, birds, and primates all pass on behaviors. But the scale and speed of our cultural transmission is unmatched. It allowed us to adapt to every environment on Earth without needing to evolve new bodies for each one. And here's the key point. Evolution doesn't vanish when change slows. It just becomes harder to detect. The genes we pass on are still changing, just more gradually, and with far less influence from survival pressures than before. Time hasn't stopped. The clock is still ticking, just more softly. This leads us to consider how nature continues to operate, regardless of our awareness, and why evolution's quiet persistence reminds us of a larger truth, that the universe doesn't care who's paying attention. Evolution does not care. Not about you, not about me, not about whether a species is intelligent or particularly charming. It operates without intention or sentiment. It doesn't aim to make things better. It just filters what works, in each moment, for each environment. That process can lead to elegance, absurdity, or both. Nature, as it turns out, is ruthlessly neutral. This is why humans, despite our inventions, and poetry, and self-help books, are subject to the same forces that shape mushrooms and meerkats. Or rather, we were. For most of our evolutionary history, our traits were selected in response to danger, disease, hunger, and weather. Then, something shifted. We changed the rules of the game. We created shelters, farms, medicine, and TikTok. Not all progress is equally useful. When we alter the pressures around us, evolution responds, often by slowing down. Traits that once meant the difference between life and death no longer matter. If you couldn't digest milk 10,000 years ago, you'd struggle to get nutrition in some parts of the world. Today, there's oat milk. Evolution didn't solve that problem. Baristas did. The same applies to social behavior. Aggression, cooperation, empathy, all were shaped by the group environments our ancestors lived in. But in modern societies, rewards come from education, economics, and institutional systems. Natural selection has taken a backseat to policy. Not that it minds. It has no opinion on minimum wage or school catchment areas. Even intelligence, often seen as our crowning achievement, isn't automatically selected for anymore. In prehistory, a sharper brain could mean better planning, tool use, or survival. Now it might just mean spending more time indoors doing online quizzes about extinct reptiles. There's no evolutionary bonus for knowing the difference between a Dimetrodon and a Diplodocus. This shift, from being shaped by nature to shaping it ourselves, hasn't made us immune to evolution, but it has made the process quieter, slower, and far less obvious. Traits that once had consequences now persist freely. Genes that once faced selection pressure now drift through generations, mostly unnoticed. And that's where the beauty lies. Evolution's indifference is not cruel. It's liberating. There's no goal we're failing to meet, no destiny we're falling short of. We're not the finished product, nor the peak of anything. We're just one outcome of a process that operates without concern, without preference, and certainly without flattery. This leads us to consider how early humans began noticing patterns in nature, and how their long, patient journey laid the foundations for our understanding of evolution itself. Long before anyone had heard of genes, DNA, or natural selection, early humans were already noticing patterns in the world around them. They may not have had microscopes, but they had eyes, memories, and the occasional desire not to be eaten. Observation wasn't academic, it was survival. People saw that children resembled their parents in height, hair, temperament. They noticed that strong hunters often had strong sons, and that the animals they tamed or the crops they planted could, over time, become more manageable. No one called it heritability, but the connection between parents and offspring wasn't lost on them. Early human societies explained these things in the ways they knew how, through stories, spirits, ancestry, and ritual. Bloodlines became sacred. Traits were attributed to blessings or curses. Intelligence, bravery, even fertility were seen as handed down through the family line, often with a healthy dose of myth. Science wasn't separate from life, because science, as we know it, didn't exist yet. Even without scientific tools, people engaged in selective breeding. Early farmers chose the biggest grains to plant. Early herders bred the calmest sheep. It wasn't framed as evolution, but it was an early form of artificial selection, nudging nature in a preferred direction. Humans didn't know what genes were, but they knew results when they saw them. Knowledge passed down orally, through generations of trial, error, and the occasional disaster. If a particular crop failed repeatedly, it was dropped. If an animal couldn't be trained, it wasn't bred. Over time, human beings became unconscious collaborators in evolutionary processes, not just adapting to the environment, but gradually reshaping it. Alongside this, they would have noticed change in the world itself: seasons, floods, migrations, extinction of local wildlife. And with those changes came shifts in behavior. Adaptation wasn't just biological, it was mental, social, and practical. Culture began to intertwine with nature, creating new pressures and new responses. What's striking is how patient this learning process must have been. Over thousands of years, early humans built a body of practical knowledge grounded entirely in observation and memory. Not glamorous, not precise, but effective enough to feed a tribe, build a shelter, and avoid whatever predator happened to be lurking behind the nearest tree. This leads us to consider how that long, slow accumulation of insight eventually sparked something new. The first recorded attempts to explain life systematically, and to uncover not just what happens, but why. As humans began settling, farming, and recording their thoughts, some started asking deeper questions. Not just, what do we see, but why does it happen? The idea that life might follow patterns, and those patterns might be explained, was a turning point. This was the slow beginning of what we now call biology. Early thinkers, like the Greek philosopher Anaximander, speculated that humans might have evolved from fish-like creatures. It wasn't science in the modern sense, more educated guesswork, but it reflected an early attempt to understand life as a process, not just a series of unrelated forms. There was no data, but there was curiosity. In the 18th and 19th centuries, more structured ideas began to appear. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck suggested that organisms could pass on traits they acquired during life, like giraffes stretching their necks to reach higher leaves. He was wrong about the mechanism, but right that species change over time. An idea moving in the right direction, just wearing the wrong trousers. Then came Charles Darwin. Often portrayed as a lonely genius struck by a sudden revelation, Darwin's real breakthrough was anything but dramatic. It was methodical, cautious, and took decades. He spent years studying barnacles, worms, and pigeons, not exactly headline material, but perfect for spotting patterns others missed. On his voyage aboard HMS Beagle, Darwin observed animals across different environments, most famously the finches of the Galapagos Islands. He noticed how their beaks varied depending on diet and location. These weren't fixed traits handed down from some perfect design. They were responses to local challenges, filtered over generations. When he published On the Origin of Species in 1859, Darwin offered a clear, testable mechanism for how species adapt. Natural selection. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise progress or perfection. It simply described how, if variation exists and some traits offer an advantage, those traits become more common. Simple, but revolutionary. What made Darwin's insight powerful was its scope. Natural selection didn't just apply to birds or beetles. It applied to everything alive, including us. And while he didn't yet know about genes or mutations, he understood that change came from inherited differences filtered by survival and reproduction. Of course, the theory wasn't universally welcomed. Some found it unsettling. Others found it inconvenient. But slowly, across decades, Darwin's careful observations changed how humans understood life. Not as fixed, designed forms, but as ever-shifting populations shaped by pressure and time. This leads us to consider how scientific tools and technology gave those ideas precision and allowed us to examine the very building blocks of evolution itself. Darwin's theory offered a powerful explanation, but without the right tools, many of its details remained out of reach. He could see change in living species and patterns in fossils, but he couldn't see the molecular machinery doing the actual work. That came later, with microscopes, chemistry, and a growing obsession with peas. Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk, conducted careful experiments on pea plants in the mid-1800s, showing that traits passed down in predictable ways. He didn't call them genes. He had no idea what DNA was. But he noticed patterns. Tall crossed with short didn't always give medium. Sometimes it gave tall again. Something invisible was controlling inheritance. At the time, no one paid much attention. Mendel's work sat unread for decades until scientists realized it filled in the missing piece Darwin never found: how variation is passed on. When rediscovered in the early 1900s, his findings helped shape what became the modern understanding of genetics, a marriage of Darwin's selection and Mendel's patterns. Meanwhile, microscopes were improving. Scientists could now observe cells dividing, chromosomes aligning, and the odd chaos that occurs when those processes go slightly wrong. In the mid-20th century, Rosalind Franklin, James Watson, and Francis Crick identified the double helix structure of DNA, a twisting ladder of chemical instructions inside every cell. With DNA came a new era of precision. Scientists could now trace traits down to their chemical origins, sequences of nucleotides like A, T, C, and G. Mutation was no longer a vague idea. It was a typo in the genetic code. A single letter change could mean a different protein, a different function, sometimes a difference between thriving and not. As techniques improved, so did our ability to measure. Population genetics emerged, allowing scientists to track gene frequencies across generations. Computers began modeling how traits would shift under different pressures, Evolution, once observed through fossils and finch beaks, was now studied in spreadsheets and simulations. Fieldwork remained crucial. Fossils, migration patterns, ecological surveys, all contributed to the big picture. But it was this interplay between field and lab, observation and measurement, that turned evolution from theory into a rigorous science. You didn't just describe change, you could now quantify it. This leads us to consider how, despite all this progress, humans, being humans, still managed to get quite a few things wrong, and what happened when science had to clean up after itself. Science is often seen as a straight road toward truth, tidy, orderly, full of confident people wearing lab coats. In reality, it's more like watching someone slowly assemble IKEA furniture using instructions from 4 different decades, while occasionally setting something on fire. Progress happens, but it involves a lot of mistakes along the way. In the early days of evolutionary theory, there were plenty of wrong turns. One of the most persistent was the idea that evolution always leads to improvement, that species are constantly striving toward perfection. This idea wasn't just wrong, it was oddly flattering. Humans, being humans, assumed we must be the goal of the process. Nature, it seems, had other plans. Another common misunderstanding was that evolution worked for the good of the species, as if animals somehow evolved traits to benefit the group. In fact, evolution acts on individuals and genes. Traits spread when they help the individual survive and reproduce, not because they're polite or socially helpful. Nature rewards selfish efficiency, not teamwork badges. Some errors went beyond misunderstanding and wandered into dangerous territory. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of scientists and politicians misused evolutionary ideas to justify racism, colonialism, and eugenics. The logic was flawed, and the science often ignored. But the appeal of turning natural selection into a social policy proved tempting and deeply harmful. Eugenics, in particular, took Darwin's ideas, removed all nuance, and applied them to humans with all the subtlety of a falling piano. It assumed some people were more fit than others and tried to control who could reproduce. It confused biology with moral value, a mistake that had horrific consequences and no basis in actual genetics. Science, fortunately, corrects itself. It takes time, and not always gracefully, but bad ideas eventually get pushed aside by better evidence. As genetics advanced, it became clear that intelligence, behavior, and physical traits were far more complex than eugenicists had claimed. Simple categories gave way to complex systems with multiple interacting genes, environments, and social factors. Even within mainstream biology, revisions continued. The ladder of progress metaphor, with humans smugly perched at the top, was replaced with the branching tree model. A sprawling, uneven network, where every species is a cousin, not a stepping stone. This doesn't mean we've reached perfect understanding. Far from it. But each error corrected brings us closer to describing nature as it is, not as we'd like it to be. And that humility, the willingness to be wrong and try again, is part of what makes science work. This leads us to consider how, despite these missteps, scientists began to test evolution more directly, not through grand claims, but through careful, repeatable experiments. By the 20th century, evolution was no longer just a theory discussed in books or debated in lecture halls. It became something scientists could test, directly, carefully, and repeatedly. And that shift mattered. Because when you start running experiments, you stop relying on clever guesses and start relying on measurable results. No offense to guesswork, of course, but it's rarely peer-reviewed. One of the clearest ways to study evolution in action is to watch fast reproducing organisms like bacteria and fruit flies. These creatures go through dozens, even hundreds of generations in a matter of weeks. That's the sort of speed evolution normally reserves for viruses and fungi, not species with long commutes and coffee habits. The most famous long-term evolution experiment was started in 1988 by Dr. Richard Lenski. He and his team began growing 12 populations of E. coli bacteria, and they've kept them going ever since. That's over 75,000 generations of microbes, all recorded, frozen at regular intervals, and analyzed. Not bad for something that started during the age of cassette tapes. Over time, the bacteria evolved in measurable ways. They became better at surviving in their lab environment. One population even developed the ability to consume a new chemical, citrate, which E. coli normally can't digest. This was clear, observable evolutionary change, not over millennia, but within a few decades, in a petri dish. Outside the lab, evolution has also been studied in the wild. The famous Grants, Peter and Rosemary, spent years studying finches on the Galapagos Islands. They documented how beak size and shape shifted after droughts and changes in food availability. These weren't just anecdotes, they were measurable, generational shifts tied to environmental pressure. Controlled breeding studies have played a role too. Dog breeders, pigeon fanciers, and farmers have used artificial selection for centuries. By choosing which animals to breed, they accelerate evolutionary change in very specific directions. You want smaller ears, fluffier tails, a cow that produces more milk? Give it a few generations and a notepad. These experiments share one important feature: variable isolation. Scientists control the environment, limit other factors, and let evolution do its thing. That's the scientific method. Test one idea at a time, observe the results, and repeat. No grand theories, just small, consistent answers that build into something much bigger. This leads us to consider how no single scientist works alone, and how, over time, evolution has become not just one person's theory, but a shared global understanding built by many minds across cultures and generations. Scientific progress doesn't happen in isolation. No one wakes up, solves evolution, and goes back to bed. The modern understanding of how life changes over time has come from thousands of researchers, some well known, most not. Working patiently across decades, continents, and generations, it's less eureka and more, well, this looks promising, let's check it again. Take Alfred Russel Wallace, for example. Working independently of Darwin, he developed a nearly identical theory of natural selection while studying wildlife in the Malay archipelago. He even sent Darwin a draft of his paper. That could have been awkward. Instead, they presented their ideas jointly, not exactly a rivalry, more a polite collision of clever observations. Through the 20th century, scientists from different fields began piecing together the full picture. Geneticists, paleontologists, ecologists, and mathematicians all brought something to the table. This collaboration formed what's now called the modern synthesis. The idea that Darwin's natural selection and Mendelian genetics weren't separate stories, but two sides of the same process. People like Theodosius Dobzhansky helped bridge biology and genetics, famously stating, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Meanwhile, Ernst Mayr, Julian Huxley, and others refined the idea of species, variation, and population change. No single person dominated the conversation. And that was the point. Scientific discovery became less about lone geniuses and more about networks of knowledge. One team builds the theory, another runs the experiment, and yet another questions the assumptions. It's a bit like a group project, where everyone actually does their part, just without the passive-aggressive emails. Importantly, this collaboration crossed borders. Fossils found in Africa informed research in Europe. DNA samples from Asia helped confirm patterns seen in South America. Evolutionary biology became a global project, tested in field stations, universities, deserts, rainforests, and laboratories on 6 continents, and yes, probably in a few very cold tents. New technologies made this collaboration even more powerful. The rise of genetic sequencing, computer modeling, and data sharing platforms allowed teams to work together across time zones and disciplines. A researcher in Kenya could collect data that would later be analyzed in Cambridge, Tokyo, or Sao Paulo, without anyone needing to leave their own time zone or tea preferences. This global, cumulative effort hasn't just deepened our understanding of how life evolves, it's also revealed how much more we still don't know. Each answer opens more questions, and each correction sharpens the next step forward. This leads us to consider just how far our tools have come, and how modern technology has taken us from rough sketches of inheritance to precise, high-resolution pictures of evolutionary change in real time. Over the last few decades, biology has had a serious upgrade. What used to require years of fieldwork or lab experiments can now be tracked, measured, and analyzed in extraordinary detail using modern technology. It's as if evolution finally got its own microscope and a supercomputer to go with it. Though sadly, still no decent parking. Genetic sequencing is one of the most powerful tools in this new era. It lets scientists read the actual DNA code of living organisms, from bacteria to blue whales. By comparing these sequences, researchers can see how closely species are related, where mutations have occurred, and how traits have been passed on or lost over time. This sort of analysis led to the mapping of the entire human genome in 2003. It revealed just how much of our DNA we share with other species, and also how much of it we still don't fully understand. For example, around 8% of human DNA appears to come from ancient viruses. A lovely little souvenir from our microbial past. Computers have become just as crucial as lab equipment. Evolutionary biologists now use complex models and simulations to test how species might change under different conditions. They can simulate populations, environments, and generations of change, all without ever needing to refill a pipette or find someone to feed the lab mice. Satellite tracking and camera traps have expanded how we monitor evolution in the wild. Scientists can now observe how animals adapt to climate change, human expansion, and habitat loss, often in real time. It's one thing to predict evolution on paper, it's quite another to see polar bears adjusting their hunting strategies as sea ice disappears. The rise of citizen science has helped too. Thanks to smartphones and online databases, people around the world contribute photos, DNA samples, and local observations. From bird migrations to insect populations, it's never been easier for ordinary people to accidentally outdo a PhD, though, ideally, they don't mention it too often. CRISPR, a gene editing tool developed in the 2010s, takes things even further. It allows scientists to alter DNA with remarkable precision. This isn't evolution as nature intended. It's evolution on demand. Of course, with that power comes a whole drawer full of ethical questions, which scientists are still busy sorting out, slowly, and with long documents. All this technology doesn't replace traditional science. It builds on it. It gives us clearer pictures, faster answers, and deeper questions. It also shows just how far we've come from Darwin's hand-drawn sketches and handwritten notebooks. This leads us to consider how evolutionary thinking is no longer limited to biology alone, but now shapes how we understand everything from culture and language to viruses and algorithms. We usually think of evolution as something that only applies to living organisms, plants sprouting new defenses, animals adapting to climate, bacteria dodging antibiotics like they're in a spy film. But the logic of evolution, variation, selection, inheritance, turns out to be surprisingly useful in other places too, including a few that don't even involve genes. Take culture. Ideas, languages, and technologies don't stand still. They mutate, spread, and occasionally disappear. An accent can evolve over generations just like a beak shape. A meme adapts for survival in the brutal environment of the group chat. It's not biology, but it behaves in a recognizably evolutionary way. The same applies to technology itself. Algorithms that use genetic programming literally evolve their own solutions by testing variations and selecting the most effective ones. They're quite good at solving problems, though they do have a worrying tendency to find loopholes and unexpected side effects. Much like teenagers, even science isn't immune. Theories are proposed, tested, challenged, refined, or abandoned. It's a process of selection and retention. In a way, scientific knowledge itself evolves, not towards perfection, but towards explanations that work better over time, though some papers are clearly surviving on sheer stubbornness alone. Then there are viruses. Unlike memes or algorithms, these are actual biological entities. But they evolve so quickly and unpredictably that we've had to build entire monitoring systems just to keep up. Flu strains shift each year. Coronavirus variants emerge and spread. This is evolution in fast forward, and it's both fascinating and occasionally inconvenient. Evolutionary thinking is now being applied to systems as diverse as economics, climate models, and even AI. Anywhere there are competing options, some form of selection, and the ability to pass on traits, evolution might have something to say. It's not about copying biology exactly, but about recognizing the same dynamics at work. This approach has its critics, of course. Not everything that changes over time is evolving, and not every outcome is selected for. Sometimes a thing just happens, survives by chance, and sticks around. Like the fact that we still use QWERTY keyboards, despite other layouts being faster and easier to learn. Still, using evolutionary principles beyond biology has helped us make sense of a complex world. It gives us a way to track how systems adapt, compete, and persist, whether they're populations, problems, or pop songs. It's less about lab coats, more about lenses for seeing change. This leads us to consider the longer view, because as powerful as evolutionary ideas are, they also raise a very old question. Where does it all lead? The word evolution often brings to mind progress, as if nature was slowly building towards something better, smarter, or more advanced. But evolution isn't a sat-nav with a destination. It's more like an endlessly glitchy algorithm, trying whatever works long enough to not immediately fail. There is no final form, just the next version that doesn't die. Natural selection doesn't aim for complexity or intelligence. It simply favors traits that improve survival and reproduction in a given environment. If being simpler works better, then simpler it is. This is why bacteria are still thriving after billions of years. No backbone, no brain, no bother. Even when complexity does arise, it's often by accident. Structures like eyes or wings evolved step by step, usually by modifying something that originally had a completely different function. Evolution recycles more than a sixth form art project. Nothing is planned in advance. It's all tinkering with what's already lying around. That said, there are certain trends. Over time, we often see increases in complexity, cooperation, and even cognition, but not because evolution wants them. These patterns emerge when they happen to work well in particular environments, and then stick around until the next ice age or asteroid decides otherwise. Humans are sometimes treated as evolution's pinnacle, as if nature has spent 4 billion years just to invent someone who gets annoyed at buffering. But from an evolutionary point of view, we're just one successful species among many. Highly adaptable, yes, but not inevitable. The dinosaurs were doing fine until, well, they weren't. When we look at the history of life, it's tempting to see progress. From bacteria to humans, pond slime to philosophy. But this idea that evolution has some kind of goal or destination is more human storytelling than scientific fact. Nature doesn't have a 5-year plan. It barely has a lunch break. Evolution isn't aiming for better, only for good enough to survive and reproduce. That's why some organisms stay relatively unchanged for millions of years, like sharks or cockroaches, whilst others branch off into dozens of new forms. Success in evolution just means fitting the local conditions, not climbing some mythical ladder of improvement. Still, there are patterns. Over time, life on Earth has become more complex, more diverse, and better at using energy. But that's not because evolution was trying to be clever. It's because, given enough time and enough variation, complexity sometimes works. Just as long as it doesn't require too much effort, which, to be fair, we can all relate to. Some scientists have proposed that evolution has a direction of sorts towards greater complexity, cooperation, or information processing. Others argue these patterns are more like side effects than targets. Just what you'd expect if you ran a process for 4 billion years with no real instructions and a lot of trial and error. Humans do play a special role though, not because we're the peak of evolution. That's a category that doesn't exist. But because we're the first species as far as we know capable of understanding evolution itself. And now, we're also starting to shape it. Artificial selection, gene editing, habitat destruction, all ways we influence which traits survive. This raises a few slightly awkward questions. Are we still evolving? The answer is yes, though not necessarily in ways we'd notice over a single lifetime. We're still subject to natural selection. Just now it includes things like access to healthcare, diet, and, depending on your postcode, exposure to pigeons with no sense of personal space. But, are we directing evolution now? Not quite. We influence it, sometimes deliberately, often accidentally, but we don't control it. Not really. Evolution works at its own pace, in all directions at once, mostly without asking for permission or filling out the relevant forms. So rather than asking where evolution is going, it may be wiser to ask how we'll adapt to whatever comes next, or how we'll respond to the changes we've already set in motion. This leads us to one final step. Not backwards, not forwards, but a wider look at how all of this fits into the larger story of the universe. To see evolution's deeper nature, we turn to maths. The idea that evolution obeys clear, testable rules, not vague claims, is one of the most powerful insights of modern biology. Patterns hidden in nature become visible when written down in equations, rather than painted in broad strokes. A foundational principle is Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. In simple terms, it describes what happens if no forces like mutation, selection, migration affect a population. The result, genetic variation, remains constant. It's a calm baseline, a mathematical, no-change scenario. Any real-world deviation marks that evolution is at work. Building on that, population genetics uses equations to predict how gene frequencies shift under various pressures. For instance, a beneficial mutation increases at a predictable rate depending on its advantage and population size. These models help scientists transform speculative stories into quantifiable forecasts, complete with numbers and confidence intervals. Fitness landscapes offer another view. They map traits onto fitness peaks and valleys, showing how populations might shift toward higher reproductive success. It's not about climbing to perfection, more like finding a hill that works well enough. Populations wander, sometimes get stuck in valleys, sometimes find new peaks. Useful, but not poetic. Evolutionary game theory adds social behavior to the mix. It models how strategies like cooperation or aggression spread in groups. Think of it as nature's chessboard, where payoffs depend on whether most players cooperate or defect. You don't need a master's in math to see how this applies to humans, though it helps avoid prison time. All these mathematical tools emphasize randomness, probability, and constraint. Evolution isn't a flourish of design, it's a process governed by numbers, statistics, and boundary conditions. Mutations occur at certain rates. Populations have limits. Chance plays a major part. That's the beauty. It's precise, measurable, and unbiased. Of course, maths simplifies. Real-world populations vary, environments shift, and unexpected events occur. Models break. The point isn't perfection, it's clarity. Equations give us lenses to see truth in the noise. To ask, does this trait increase because of selection or because of chance? This leads us to consider how these numbers connect to more fundamental levels, like particles and space-time, where the rules of the universe come into play in shaping life itself. If evolution is shaped by selection and variation, then it's also shaped by the universe that allows those things to happen. Beneath DNA, beneath chemistry, even beneath the cell, lies the machinery of physics. And it's here, at the base of it all, where the rules of life get written. Atoms don't care about survival or reproduction. They follow physical laws. Hydrogen bonds form because electrons are distributed in a particular way. DNA only twists into a double helix because of specific chemical forces. Even mutation rates are influenced by the shape of molecules and the limits of thermodynamics. Zoom out slightly, and we see that biology emerges from what physics allows. Carbon can form 4 stable bonds, which makes it ideal for building complex molecules. Water has weird properties, like being less dense as a solid, that help life survive temperature swings. These aren't designed features. They're what you get when the universe runs on certain equations. Some scientists have asked whether evolution itself is written into the laws of nature. After all, variation and competition happen anytime matter can replicate with imperfections. From that angle, evolution isn't a quirk of Earth, but something that might emerge in any universe with the right physical conditions. There's a limit to how far we can go with this, of course. Theories about multiverses and fine-tuning tend to raise more questions than they answer. And to be honest, the idea that the laws of physics were made so life could evolve sounds dangerously close to the kind of arguments someone uses to win a pub debate without actually understanding quantum mechanics. Still, it's useful to recognize that evolution, messy and open-ended as it is, doesn't float free. It operates within boundaries. Energy must be conserved. Entropy increases. Mutations happen because molecules jiggle and bonds break. The rules of the game aren't up for negotiation. Evolution just plays it with what it's got. This takes us full circle. Life evolves because matter behaves in certain ways. Stars form, planets cool, chemicals react, and somehow cells start dividing. There's no grand plan here, just patterns that happen to produce things that copy themselves better than their neighbors. And so, from physics to genes, from mutation to culture, evolution links everything. It simply carries on, shaped by what came before, nudged by the rules underneath. This leads us to consider something quietly profound. That evolution, without meaning to, gave rise to beings who ask questions like, why? At some point, life began asking questions. Not metaphorically, literally. Somewhere along the evolutionary path, a nervous system developed that could wonder what happens next. Brains, once good only for finding food or avoiding predators, started doing something far less practical. Thinking about thinking. This didn't happen all at once. Most species, to be blunt, have no concept of questions. Your average squid isn't lying awake pondering its place in the cosmos. But at some point in human ancestry, likely within the last few 100,000 years, language, memory, and social learning reached a point where curiosity got formalized. Asking why is a strange act. It requires recognizing not just that things happen, but that they could happen differently. A child pulling at the edge of a blanket might be trying to find a toy, or might just be testing what happens if the universe does something new. That second option is the beginning of science, or chaos, possibly both. The evolutionary roots of this behavior make sense. A creature that can anticipate danger, plan for the future, or understand social rules has an advantage. But there's a side effect. We also invent explanations for things we don't understand. Storms, illness, stars. If you don't know the cause, you're liable to make one up. This is where things get interesting. Because the same evolutionary pressures that shaped the human brain also made it prone to stories, myths, and meaning. Our ancestors didn't just observe the world, they interpreted it, sometimes helpfully, sometimes not, but always through a lens built by natural selection. You could say the scientific method is humanity's attempt to clean that lens, to stop fooling ourselves with nice-sounding tales, and actually test what's real. Which, given our tendency to see faces in clouds and meaning in toast, is no small achievement. Evolution gave us the toolkit: observation, memory, reasoning, but not the instructions. And so we ask, why? Not just about how things work, but about our own existence. Why are we here? Why do we care? Why do we wonder? These aren't scientific questions in the strict sense, they're emotional ones. But the fact we can ask them is itself a scientific fact. This leads us to consider the final piece: what evolution might mean. Not to the universe, but to us. What it's like to live in a world where everything has a cause, but not necessarily a purpose. After everything we've explored, here's the slightly uncomfortable truth. Evolution doesn't care. It doesn't care about fairness, happiness, suffering, or justice. It's not trying to make anything better. It's not trying at all. Evolution is simply the result of things surviving long enough to make more of themselves, and passing on the instructions for doing so. That's not to say evolution is random. Natural selection is deeply structured, but it's structured by what works, not by what's good. If a trait helps an organism reproduce, it spreads. Even if that trait involves parasitism, manipulation, or just being really annoying at 6 a.m., looking at you, cockerels. This is part of why evolution produces so many strange outcomes. A panda's thumb isn't a real thumb, it's a modified wrist bone. The human eye has a blind spot. And don't get me started on the recurrent laryngeal nerve in giraffes, which takes the scenic route from brain to throat via the chest. Evolution bodges together whatever happens to work. It also means that morality isn't built in. Nature doesn't punish cruelty or reward kindness. Those ideas come from us, shaped by culture, philosophy, and yes, evolved social instincts. But evolution isn't aiming for justice. The wasp that paralyzes its prey so its young can eat it alive isn't evil, it's just effective. Still, knowing this doesn't make life meaningless. In fact, it gives us a certain freedom. If there's no built-in purpose, we get to choose our own. We can decide what matters, who matters, and how we want to live. Not because nature demands it, but because we do. And that, weirdly, is quite empowering. Understanding that evolution doesn't care can also help explain a lot of things, like why we suffer from back pain. Evolution didn't optimize for desk jobs, or why we crave sugar. It used to be rare and valuable. Now, it's just available and regrettable. Knowing where we came from lets us understand what we're stuck with. But it's also a reminder that evolution won't solve our problems for us. Climate change, inequality, pandemics. These aren't issues natural selection will sort out nicely on its own. If anything, leaving it to evolution would lead to outcomes we probably wouldn't enjoy. Nature's idea of a solution often involves a lot of extinction. This leads us to consider one last, quite human question. Now that we understand how evolution works, what are we going to do with that knowledge? So now we know evolution doesn't care. But we do. We care about each other, about the future, about the planet. And unlike natural selection, we can plan, reflect, and try not to make everything worse. Which is lucky, really, because leaving it all up to chance hasn't always worked out brilliantly. Humanity sits at a curious crossroads. We're a product of evolution, yet we're now capable of influencing it. Through medicine, technology, and culture, we're reshaping the very process that shaped us. Natural selection is no longer the only game in town. In some ways, we've hacked the system. Vaccines, for example, protect us from diseases that evolution hasn't had time to weed out. Glasses let people with rubbish eyesight live full lives. And you're reading this thanks to a species that turned a primate brain into a civilization, and then decided to spend part of that on writing jokes about cockerels. But our power comes with consequences. Artificial selection has already changed thousands of species, from crops to companion animals. These aren't science fiction ideas anymore. They're real debates happening now in labs and ethics committees. And then there's climate change, a global problem caused by the side effects of evolutionary success. We became so good at survival that we've disrupted the systems we depend on. Nature doesn't care if we mess it up. The atmosphere has no feelings, but we do, and so the responsibility falls on us. Culture, too, plays its part. Evolution gave us brains capable of cooperation and conflict. Whether we build fairer societies or repeat the same mistakes depends not on biology, but on choices. Natural selection may explain the past, but it doesn't excuse the future. So what do we do with all this? The answer, perhaps, is simple enough. Understand how life works, and try to use that understanding wisely. Learn from the brutal elegance of evolution without copying its indifference. Plan for what nature never could: long-term well-being, fairness, sustainability. Which brings us to a final thought. Evolution gave us the tools to ask big questions, but what we do with those tools, how we shape our species, our societies, our future, is entirely up to us. Nature isn't steering the ship anymore, we are. Let's step back for a moment. The story we've followed, from single-celled beginnings to self-aware primates, is remarkable not just for what evolved, but for the fact that something evolved that could notice. A species that doesn't just survive, but sits around wondering why it exists in the first place. Our understanding of evolution didn't come quickly. For most of human history, people explained life's complexity through myth, religion, or guesswork. Then, about 160 years ago, Darwin proposed something quite different: that life evolves through natural selection. It wasn't flashy, just quietly revolutionary. Since then, evolutionary science has expanded and deepened. We now understand genes, mutations, and inheritance. We've connected the tree of life through shared DNA. And we've seen the fingerprints of evolution everywhere. In the fossil record, in bacteria outwitting antibiotics, even in our own bodies. It hasn't always been smooth sailing. Evolution has been misunderstood, misused, and occasionally dragged into politics where it absolutely did not want to be. But despite the confusion and the occasional conspiracy theorist, the core idea has stood firm. Life changes over time, and those changes are shaped by survival. What's changed, though, is us. With science, we've begun to understand how the natural world works and where we fit in. We've moved from guessing why giraffes have long necks to testing it. From assuming we're separate from nature to recognizing we're a product of it. This knowledge hasn't made us better than nature. If anything, it's made us more aware of how limited we still are. We still make decisions based on short-term gains, still struggle to cooperate, still eat things we know we'll regret. But knowing why we do those things is a decent first step. And so, our understanding continues to evolve. New tools, like CRISPR or ancient DNA sequencing, open new doors. New questions emerge about consciousness, cooperation, and culture. Evolution isn't just a topic in textbooks, it's an ongoing investigation into how life works, and how we might shape it from here. Which leads us to one final scale of evolution. Not in genes or fossils, but in ideas. If we've come this far by understanding the past, perhaps the next step is using that understanding to shape a future we actually want. After all this time, It might be tempting to imagine evolution as something that happened in the past. Dinosaurs roaming about, apes picking up sticks, Victorian scientists squinting at finches. But evolution isn't history, it's ongoing. And we're in it. Right now. Possibly wearing socks. Evolution never stopped. Every living thing is still part of this slow, relentless process. From bacteria developing resistance to new antibiotics, to elephants born with smaller tusks, because we keep poaching the big ones. Nature is constantly testing and tweaking. It's not finished. It never will be. Even humans are still evolving. In fact, modern life is creating new pressures. Our diets, cities, technologies, and even medical systems all influence who survives, who reproduces, and which genes get passed on. Evolution doesn't care if it's natural or artificial, it just works with what it's given. Take wisdom teeth. Useless for most people now, and often removed. But there's growing evidence that some populations are evolving to have fewer of them. Or the rise in lactose tolerance in parts of the world, a clear genetic response to dairy farming. It's not dramatic, but it's real. Our cultural behaviors also play a role. Things like who we choose as partners, how we raise children, and what environments we live in can all feed back into evolution. We're shaping the conditions of our own future, even if we rarely stop to think about it. Most people are too busy trying to find clean socks. Technology, too, complicates things. Some argue we've opted out of natural selection by using science to keep people alive and healthy regardless of their genetics. Others say we've simply created new kinds of selection, driven by access, adaptation, and innovation. Either way, change continues. It's also worth remembering, evolution doesn't mean improvement, it means change. Species can evolve to be smaller, blinder, or weirder if that helps them survive. There's no end goal, no perfect form, just the messy, often inconvenient process of life, adapting to whatever nonsense it's currently dealing with. So the story isn't over. It never really is. Evolution is still shaping the world around us, and within us, even if it's slower than we'd like, and completely uninterested in our opinions. And as we keep changing the world, evolution will keep responding, whether we notice or not. So, what does all this mean for us? If evolution isn't over, if we're part of it, and shaping it as we go, what does that actually imply for how we live, behave, or plan ahead? This isn't just an academic curiosity. It's about understanding ourselves in context. First, it reminds us that we're not separate from nature. We are nature. Our brains, instincts, immune systems, all sculpted by the same processes that shaped jellyfish and moss. The urge to fit in, the craving for sugar, the fear of snakes. They're not character flaws. They're echoes of what helped our ancestors stay alive. But there's a catch. Evolution doesn't work toward truth or goodness. It works toward survival. Some of the instincts we've inherited might be outdated or even harmful in modern environments, like hoarding calories, distrusting outsiders, or panicking when our phone battery hits 3%. Understanding evolution also encourages a bit of humility. We're not the pinnacle of progress. We're not more evolved than other species. We're just one outcome of millions of years of branching paths and lucky breaks. Sharks haven't changed much in 400 million years, and they seem fine with it. This perspective can also help us be more forgiving of ourselves and of others. We all carry ancient wiring in a rapidly changing world. That doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it does explain why certain patterns, conflict, anxiety, tribalism, are hard to shake. They're not just cultural, they're biological. On a broader scale, evolution gives us tools to solve problems. Understanding how bacteria adapt helps us design better antibiotics. Knowing how traits spread can inform public health or conservation. And recognizing our own biases can help us step back and make wiser choices. Occasionally, of course, none of this means we're powerless. Quite the opposite. By understanding our evolutionary heritage, we gain the ability to choose how we move forward. We're no longer just reacting to nature, we're reflecting on it. We can decide what we value and what future we want to evolve into. This leads us to consider something rather hopeful. If we're the first species on Earth to understand evolution, maybe we're also the first to consciously guide it. That's not just a scientific milestone. It's a responsibility, one we've only just begun to grasp. After everything, fossils, genes, natural selection, extinction, survival, what has evolution really taught us? Beyond the mechanics and the history, is there something deeper we're meant to take from all this? Possibly. But brace yourself. It's not exactly the stuff of motivational posters. At its core, evolution shows us that life is not planned, it's not tidy, and it definitely doesn't care about fairness. Species come and go, traits rise and fall, environments shift. What survives is not what's best, just what works well enough to keep going. And sometimes, that's pigeons. This isn't meant to be bleak. In fact, there's something strangely comforting about it. If nature muddles through by trial and error, then maybe we can stop expecting everything, including ourselves, to be perfect. Life isn't flawless. It's functional, and that's usually enough. It also reminds us how connected we all are. Every species alive today, no matter how weird or wobbly, is part of the same tree of life. There's no them and us. Just branches, splitting and twisting, shaped by time and struggle. If you trace far enough back, you'll find your relatives had fins, or fur, or neither. Then there's the matter of time. Evolution doesn't rush. It operates on scales so large we struggle to comprehend them. A few million years here, a few mass extinctions there. From that perspective, our daily chaos, emails, exams, broken toasters, starts to look fairly minor. Not irrelevant, just not as urgent as we tend to think. This perspective can help us be better stewards of the world. We now understand how fragile life can be, and how long recovery takes when we break things. We know we're not the center of nature, but a part of it. And if we're smart, or at least not reckless, we might last a while longer yet. There's also something to be said for adaptability. Evolution doesn't reward strength, intelligence, or beauty. It rewards the ability to adjust when things change. And, let's be honest, things always change. Whether it's a new predator, a different climate, or just a new school, survival often depends on flexibility more than anything else. So perhaps the biggest lesson of evolution is this: life isn't a competition to win. It's a process to participate in, one full of uncertainty, trade-offs, and the occasional duck-billed platypus. And we're part of it. Not spectators, not rulers, just another species, trying to make it through. We end with a deceptively simple question: are humans still evolving? It feels like something we should know, but the answer, much like our species, is still in progress. Evolution hasn't stopped, It's just wearing a different outfit now. Less saber-toothed tiger, more public transport, and climate data. To evolve, you need three things: variation, inheritance, and selection. We've still got all three. Humans vary wildly in genes, traits, and behaviors. These differences get passed down, some more successfully than others. And there's still selection, though it's less about outrunning predators and more about navigating modern life. Like trying to survive a group chat without saying something socially catastrophic. The pressures have shifted, but they haven't disappeared. Diseases, diets, urban environments, even mate choice, all of these shape who reproduces and which traits get handed on. Natural selection doesn't need to be dramatic. It can be as subtle as whether someone lives long enough to have grandchildren. Some changes are already visible. For instance, lactose tolerance. The ability to digest milk as an adult is still spreading in parts of the world. Our immune systems continue to adapt to new pathogens. Even brain structures might be shifting slightly, though frankly, it's hard to tell whether that's evolution or just smartphones making us all slightly worse at concentrating. What's different now is how much we interfere. Through medicine, technology, and culture, we can override natural selection in ways no other species has. We treat diseases that would once have been fatal. We plan families, freeze eggs, swap organs, and yes, tweak genes. Whether that's brilliant or reckless depends who you ask. Either way, it means we're not just passengers anymore. There's also cultural evolution, where ideas, behaviors, and technologies spread faster than genes. Language, tools, agriculture, the internet, these shape our lives and environments so rapidly that biology can barely keep up. We may be biologically similar to humans 50,000 years ago, but culturally, we live on another planet. So yes, we're still evolving. But it's not the slow crawl of the past. It's a tangled mix of genes, culture, tech, and chance. Natural selection hasn't ended. It's just been joined by a few uninvited guests in the back seat, arguing over the map and occasionally fiddling with the engine. And as for where it's all going, well, that depends partly on us. Evolution isn't a story with a conclusion, it's a process, and we're both characters and authors now. Not in control, perhaps, but definitely no longer just along for the ride. Evolution, as we've seen, is not a straight line. It's more like a never-ending experimental project with no clear outcome and very little health and safety. And the idea that it might one day finish is about as realistic as a tidy teenager's bedroom. Life keeps changing because the world keeps changing. Even in the most stable environments, random mutations still pop up. Genes shuffle. New combinations emerge. Most of them are completely useless, of course. Nature's equivalent of putting socks on a snake. But every now and then, one turns out to be useful. And off it goes, spreading quietly through the population. Sometimes the changes are small. A tweak to metabolism, or a shift in behavior. Other times, they're more dramatic, like new body plans or strange new features. But big or small, they keep stacking up over time. And while individual species come and go, evolution as a process keeps chugging along, slowly, messily, relentlessly. This isn't just a thing of the past, or something limited to remote islands. It's happening right now, everywhere. In bacteria adapting to antibiotics, in crops reshaped by farming, in urban foxes, pigeons, and mosquitoes, all learning to thrive in cities. If there's one constant in life, it's that nothing stays the same for long. We're also part of this story. Our actions, cutting forests, warming the planet, moving species around the globe, create new pressures that affect evolution across the tree of life. Whether it's moths changing color in polluted air, or animals shifting their ranges with the climate, life is constantly adjusting. There's also the possibility that we'll nudge evolution more deliberately in future. With technologies like gene editing, synthetic biology, and artificial selection, we might not just watch evolution unfold. We might start to direct it. That comes with potential, of course. And also, a rather large number of ethical headaches. But even if we try to steer the process, we're unlikely to ever control it fully. Evolution is too messy, too complex, and too tangled in randomness. It doesn't follow our plans. It doesn't care about our priorities. And it certainly doesn't ask for permission, which, if nothing else, makes it very relatable. So the story of life isn't finished. It's barely even paused. Species will continue to evolve. New ones will appear, others will vanish. And whilst we can try to understand it, maybe even shape a bit of it, we're still part of the system, not standing outside it. The experiment continues, with or without us. Tonight, we've taken a stroll, a slow, meandering one, through the history of life on Earth. From simple molecules drifting in shallow seas to brains arguing about what counts as a sandwich. Evolution didn't plan any of it. There was no goal, just a long string of changes, experiments, and dead ends, with the occasional breakthrough. We began with early chemistry, not particularly glamorous, unless you're very fond of hydrogen. But over time, atoms linked up in increasingly complex ways, forming self-replicating molecules. Once that happened, natural selection took hold. Not quickly, not neatly, but inevitably. And slowly, life started to get better at staying alive. Single cells gave way to multicellular organisms. Bodies appeared, so did behaviors. Over millions of years, the tree of life branched out into worms, fish, fungi, and ferns. Most of it went extinct. Of course, evolution's not sentimental, but some branches kept going, and one of them, rather unexpectedly, led to primates. Then came humans, not instantly clever, not particularly strong, and prone to sunburn, but remarkably good at adapting, with brains wired for language, tools, and storytelling. We didn't escape evolution, we just added culture and technology to the mix. And somehow, we ended up debating the ethics of crisps being called sharing size. Along the way, we saw how genes work, how populations change, and how traits spread. We tackled big moments, mass extinctions, land invasions, and oxygen disasters. And we looked at smaller details, like why your spine is still annoyed about walking upright. Evolution's history is written in the fossils, but also in our backs, lungs, and cells. We saw that evolution isn't just about the past. It's still ticking along, in bacteria, in animals, in us. Some changes are driven by nature, others are nudged along by technology or social systems. But whatever the cause, the principle stays the same. Variation, selection, inheritance, time. And crucially, we saw that there's no finish line. Evolution doesn't stop because a species invents trousers or landing pages. As long as life exists, it will change. Not always for the better. Not always for a reason. But always, eventually. Because environments shift, mutations happen, and chance plays its hand. So the story so far isn't really a conclusion. It's more of a bookmark. Life will keep evolving. And the world we pass on, shaped by our choices, technologies, and mistakes, will help decide where it goes next. Whether we like it or not, we're part of that story now. After all this, it's fair to ask, why bother? Why learn about evolution when you could be doing something far more exciting, like alphabetizing your sock drawer or pretending you understand insurance? The answer is surprisingly simple, because evolution explains life. Not just life in the abstract, but life as we live it, every day. From the structure of your spine to the reason your nose runs when you're ill, evolution shapes our biology in ways we often take for granted. The aches, the allergies, the tendency to store fat when we're stressed. None of it is random. It's history written into our bodies by generations of survival and compromise. It also helps us understand where we came from, not in the birth certificate and embarrassing baby photos sense, but in a deeper planetary context. Evolution tells us how life changes, how species form, and why nothing alive today is exactly like anything that lived before. It gives us a sense of connection and a sense of perspective. That perspective is especially useful when we look around at nature. Every living thing, from ants to oak trees to blue whales, is related through shared ancestry. Evolution helps explain the unity of life, as well as its variety. And it gives us a framework for studying ecosystems, behaviors, and the odd habits of fruit flies. More practically, evolutionary thinking is at the core of fields like medicine, conservation, and agriculture. It explains why viruses change, why some treatments stop working, and how pests adapt to pesticides. It's not just theory. It's the difference between planning ahead and being constantly surprised by the natural world, like it's some kind of prank show. It also has ethical weight. Understanding evolution reminds us that humans aren't separate from nature, we're part of it. Our actions shape the evolutionary future of countless species, including, potentially, ourselves. That doesn't mean we should panic, but it does mean we have a responsibility to think beyond the next fiscal quarter. There's also something quietly comforting in knowing we're not the end of the story. We're a branch on a vast, tangled tree, shaped by chance, selection, and time. That knowledge doesn't make life meaningless. If anything, it makes it more meaningful. We're here against the odds, built from ancient atoms and accidental advantages. So why does evolution matter? Because it tells us what life is, how it works, why it changes, and what it might become. It's not just a theory for textbooks. It's the thread that runs through everything alive. And the more we understand it, the more clearly we see the world and our place in it. And that brings our journey to a gentle close. If you're still with us, you're welcome to drift off with another of our sleepy deep dives. Until then, rest well and good night.